So we're going to talk about graduation. That's what we want for all of our students, and our journey with our state systemic improvement plan can really help. I just want to acknowledge my colleague Tracy Ficca. She couldn't join us today, but we did collaborate on this project. So I just wanted to acknowledge her today. So 3 objectives for today. I'm going to talk to you about what is our state systemic improvement plan. What does that look like, feel like, and sound like? Just to give you a little bit of definition of that. I also want to talk to you a bit about an early warning system. How do we collect data and make sure that's an effective, appropriate, efficient way that we can collect data? Then the third thing is we've got lots of great resources. I'm going to show you how you can access all those great resources from our patent website, as well as some national resources that may really help you. So those are the 3 things that we're going to focus in on today. So before we get started, let's do a little pop quiz here. What year was it? The Jetsons. Anybody know when the Jetsons came out?
73. 80.
Okay, we have 80, 73, 83. Let me tell you, it's less than 70. We go lower?
68.
Lower.
56.
1962. Think about that. Over 60 years ago. All right, okay, it was a good year, right? 1962, the Jetsons came out. Look at this. Fisher-Price rotary phone toy. When do you think that came out? 1961. So think about that. 1962, we have the Jetsons. 1961, we have the Fisher-Price phone. What I want us to think about is sometimes we focus in on what's in front of us, but we need to think about what's going to happen post-secondary, what's going to happen in the future. Because here's what happened in 2020, where we were back in 1962 with the Jetsons, right? We were doing Zoom meetings and telehealth and teledoc and FaceTime and online classes. And then now we're into 2023, and we've got vacuum cleaners that clean, our rooms and Roombas. And now we're into AI. So when we look at this, we really want to take a look at where are we taking our students? It's about graduation, but we need to think differently. And so that's what I want us to think about as we're looking at our state systemic improvement plan, which is to increase graduation rates and decrease dropout rates for students with disabilities. That's what this is all about. And so with that, it's a comprehensive framework. It's not a program, it's a framework that we provide our schools and sites to show here's what works. Here's how you can help all of your students, not just students with disabilities, but your English learners, your students who may be more marginalized, your diverse students, whether it's socioeconomic, racially, ethnically, and we want to make sure that we're providing the best possible resources so they can be successful. So it's this framework to allow LEAs to implement evidence-based strategies. So with that, when I say we, there's a whole group of patent offices in the East, the Central, and the West that support our learning sites. And so I'll share a little bit about what that looks like and share some of that information. But way back in probably 2014-15, patent consultants met with the National Dropout Prevention Center and said, how do we do this? Where do we even start? So you may be thinking about that too. Where do we even begin? How do we even start to make sure that we're on the right track? So they suggested 5 phases. And just so you all know, this PowerPoint is available to you on the app. So you will have all this information. So phase 1 is we need to create a team. We need a team at the state level, but we also need a team at the local level. So we're going to talk about what does that team look like? What are some of the barriers and challenges, but also how do we overcome some of those barriers and challenges? We're also going to take a look at what are we collecting as far as data, and we're going to look at that early warning system. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that and how we've used that efficiently. Phase 3 is looking at what are the interventions that we want to put in place for our students. So I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Kathleen Lane, but she does a lot of work around positive behavior interventions and supports. And I always remember one of her phrases she said at one of our conferences. She said, if you screen, you must intervene, right? How many of us were data rich, but what are we doing with that data? Not only that, we need to make sure we're intervening appropriately. So What are the appropriate interventions and supports after we look at the data to see who may need it? Phase 4 is looking at, we need a plan. All right, who's going to be responsible for this? How are we going to pay for this? What are the resources we have? What about personnel? We're all talking about personnel concerns, but who's going to help and who's going to support? What professional development do we need? And then phase 5 is this working or not? We need to evaluate our plan to see this is working, this is not working, what do we need to do differently, or what do we need to keep doing so we even get better and better? So those are the 5 phases that we went through. So all of you have this coherent improvement strategies. This takes a look at our theory of action. So we said to all of our learning sites, we said, again, if you screen, you must intervene. So how are we going to intervene and help our students? So we have 7 coherent improvement strategies that we're helping our students and schools with. So the first one is an early warning system. So in the booklet, you're going to find one-pagers for each one of those. All right, so we're going to talk about what do we need for an early warning system? What data are we collecting and why are we collecting that data? Based upon that data, then what interventions or coherent improvement strategies do we want to embed? Now, our schools didn't pick all of these at one time. Less is more. Maybe pick one thing based on our data that we need to work on. So number 2 is multi-tiered systems of supports for academics. Number 3 is what this conference really is also about, in addition to academics, is behavior, a multi-tiered system of support for behavior. Number 4 is looking at attendance. So how many of you are having issues around attendance, right? Big thing, right? If our kids aren't there, how are they going to graduate? So we're looking at what are attendance strategies and alternative programming. That's where we need to get to the Jetsons versus the Fisher-Price phone. A 7:30 to 2:30 schedule doesn't work for everybody. Oh my goodness, you mean we have to offer a different schedule? Yeah, maybe, right? So looking at what are some alternatives. Maybe our students can learn some courses online. We also need to have culturally responsive practices. How are we engaging our students that they feel like they belong, that they want to come to school, that they're engaged, right? Do they ever see themselves reflected in the curriculum and the content? Do they have student voice? That's what we're talking about with culturally responsive practices. Then how can we get our families engaged? Because we know at the high school level in particular, that wanes quite a bit. So how do we get that family engagement? And then finally, secondary transition. What are, again, those post-secondary outcomes that we can help our students prepare? Whether it's an internship, career and tech education, maybe looking at some alternatives, or looking at a college and career path. So those are the things that we're taking a look at. So like I said, all of you have access to this booklet that shares a one-pager of what each of those are about. And again, I'll show you how you can access any of these materials and you can order them at no cost. The other thing I want to share with you then, I've been speaking about these learning sites. So back in 2015, we had what was called iteration number 1, where again, our patent offices and colleagues worked with 12 high schools across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They were urban, suburban, and rural schools. We had 1 cyber school in that cohort, and they comprised again across the east, the west, and the central part of Pennsylvania. We also partner with HUNE, which is a community parent center in Philadelphia, and we have Luz Hernandez here, who's the director of HUNE. So if you want to get more information, it's a really wonderful collaboration where they do a lot around family engagement, after school programming, but particularly our students who are English learners, and how they can really be successful. They've done a lot too around that sense of belonging and engagement and student voice. So we partnered with them in addition to our 12 high schools. So remember, we had those 7 coherent improvement strategies that our schools could select. All of them were required to have an early warning system. So how did we do? We worked with them for 6 years. What does the data show us? What were our results? Well, we have some really promising things. So we followed students through a longitudinal path. So we had our first group of students who started with us in 2015, and we started collecting data in January 2016. So you can see there, our first cohort, 66% were on track, in about just a few years later, August 2020, 99% were on track. Okay, so following that group. Then we took a look at the second group of students, and they started in October 2016. 69% were on track. By August 2020, 95% were on track. Then we have our third cohort of students, and we had in 2017 of October, 67% were on track. Then we got to 82% were on track. So what you're seeing here is the longer the students were there, you see how we had more students who stayed on track and fewer students who were off track. Also, the schools got more proficient at offering the interventions and supports as time went on. So not only were the students who improved, but the system improved in how to address the students coming in after cohort 1. So by the time we got to cohort 3, even though they weren't in as long, we had some supports and things in place that could really help and support them. The other thing we took a look at is a lot of times if you're off track, you're not only off track in one area. And when we say off track, we're looking at attendance, behavior, and course performance. So guess what? If I'm not in school, I'm going to get behind in my coursework. Then a lot of times I go to class. I don't want people to know that I'm off track. I get my behavior disrupted. It's a domino effect. So we had many students who were off track in more than one area. So again, going back to group number 1, looking at from January 2016, 65% of them had more than one area where they were off track. But just after 4.5 years of implementation, only 2% had multiple areas where they were off track. So did we make a difference? You bet we did. All right. So a lot of students, even if they still may have been off track, not as many had multiple risk factors. Let's go to group 2. So again, looking at October 2016, 44% of the students had multiple areas where they were off track or at risk. After just 4 years of implementation, it went down to 4. So we definitely, again, we made that positive impact. And then finally, group 3, starting in October 2017, 39% had multiple risk factors, but just 3 years later, we were down to 12%. So what we were doing is working, right? So you're probably saying, okay, what did you do, right? So you mentioned the 7 coherent improvement strategies. So now let's take a look at what we actually learned from doing this. So there are 4 key areas I want to share with you: teaming, data collection, implementation of those 7 coherent improvement strategies, as well as what's the action plan. So in looking at this, let's start with teaming. We know it's a challenge to get everybody together. When do we meet? How long do we meet? Who's at the table? So what we found is that who are a core team members to meet. It's having the right people at the table. It's not necessarily the number of people, but it's the right people. The other thing I would recommend, or what we found as a team, is smaller is better. Sometimes if you have 10, 12 people, it's hard for them to meet. So this core team is meeting on a monthly basis. So that core team comprised of an administrator, a special education administrator, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, because we want those 2 departments particularly talking to one another, as well as a data coordinator. When I started teaching, which was many moons ago, someone said to me, you need to know the custodian and you need to know the secretary, right? They run everything. I would say now you need to know the custodian, you need to know the secretary, you need to know your data coordinator, okay? So you need a data coordinator on your team. Now you may want to invite additional team members when you're looking at certain quarterly points of data, or other times maybe you're looking at a specific student. So that may be where you invite the school counselor, a school psychologist, if you have a truancy officer, if attendance is a big area of concern, or maybe your social worker. But maybe they're not coming to every single meeting, but you have this core team that's meeting on a regular basis. Also, you may want to have a team after that monthly meeting where you're going to meet with individual students. You're meeting them with families. So we made sure that we had that team that was small and the right people at the table. The other thing we found was, how are we collecting our data? So I showed you that longitudinal data we were sharing with you. We had group 1, group 2, and group 3. And schools were utilizing their own early warning system and then sending that information back to us on Excel documents. At one point, we had 36 Excel documents that we were looking through every quarter. And it was just way too much. So we found we needed an online system where we were gathering that data with our cohort of schools to make sure that we were gathering that together. So for this next iteration that we're working on currently, our sites then submit their data from their early warning system into an online platform so that we can look at that and analyze it quickly and easily, as well as the schools can. We also found we needed the data coordinator that I mentioned, but not all our data coordinators may be necessarily data analysts. So I have one data coordinator, she doesn't know that, if you're a senior and that you only need 4 credits for math perhaps, maybe there's a reason why they don't have a math grade. So sometimes you need, in addition to that data coordinator, somebody who can analyze and interpret the data. So we found for this next iteration, if your data coordinator is not necessarily a data analyst, or they're a data analyst but not necessarily interpreter, you need to find someone who kind of knows more the in-depth pieces of the data. So that may or may not be the same person as your data coordinator. And then finally, we needed a standardized protocol so that our meetings look the same each time. It's just maybe some of the topics may change and the roles may change. We also looked at our coherent improvement strategies. Everyone, like I said, had to implement the early warning system. But we also found, and as research shares with us, it takes 3 to 5 years to implement anything. And I'm going to use the F word, fidelity, right? So to implement anything well, you need to make sure you've got 3 to 5 years of implementation.
And Laura, this was the keynote today, remember?
Right.
We talked about that a lot.
That was part of the keynote today. And I think about, I understand that, yeah, it takes 3 to 5 years. But here's the thing we also found. I've got seniors sitting right here in front of me. They don't have 3 to 5 years, right? We've got to do something now, because if we don't intervene now, what are we going to do? So we had to look at 2 ways of looking at this, short-term and long-term. So what are we going to do short-term to help those seniors who may be at risk of not graduating? But then what are we going to do so when our freshmen get to be senior year, we're not going to have as many seniors at risk of not graduating. They're going to stay on track. They're going to stay in school. So we found that you need to look at immediate supports for your seniors particularly, but then you also need to look at what's the system we can get in place. So again, particularly looking at that 9th grade and having it supporting them later on. Our school selected Check and Connect as one of the most common interventions, and that was listed under a multi-tiered system of support for behavior. So Check and Connect is a mentoring program from the University of Minnesota. It's one of the few programs that has research behind it, has evidence-based research behind it. So I'll share a little bit more about that as we go along. But we're using it as a tier 3 model for our students who may be really off track, not just in behavior, but again, what's their attendance look like? Maybe their grades are suffering. So those are the things that we're looking at. So we have our action plans, and probably you're thinking when I share the 7 coherent improvement strategies, family engagement. When we said to our schools, looking at your data, select the coherent improvement strategy you'd like to intervene with and utilize. Guess what they picked, which I understand. They picked academics and they picked behavior, right? Because that's the immediate need, right? If our students aren't here, or if they're misbehaving, or if they're having trouble with grades, we need to intervene. So a lot of schools selected alternative programming or MTSS behavior or for academics. No one picked family engagement. So we said, you know what? We don't want family engagement to be an add-on or an afterthought. We need our families engaged with us, right? And engagement may be different than coming to the parent-teacher conference. So we put this column into our action plan called family engagement. So whatever we're doing, how are we engaging families in that process? How are you sharing grades with families? Are you only calling a family member when there's a problem? Are we doing any positive kind of engagement with families? Are we doing anything beyond just the parent-teacher kind of conference? So we wanted to make sure our families had a really great way. So no matter what we're doing, behavior, check and connect, attendance, early warning system. So if you have an action plan now, think about, do we have a column for family engagement? So whatever we're doing, we're engaging families. Guess what also schools did not select? Culturally responsive practices. How are we looking at equity for our students? So with our second iteration here, we included equity considerations in the action plan. Maybe we need to look at our data and disaggregate it. Are our students who are African American males being suspended more than our students who are white? And then what are we doing about that? Are we seeing more office system referrals for students who are from more marginalized groups versus those who are not? So maybe it's starting to disaggregate the data. Maybe it's starting to look at our curriculum. Do we ever see students who are reflected in that content? So those are the lessons we learned with action planning. The other thing that we are really focusing in on is aligning with school improvement plans. So if a school is in school improvement, whether it's comprehensive school improvement or maybe it's their subgroup of students for disabilities aren't graduating at the same rate as students who are general education students, what's in your school improvement plan? We're not going to recreate the wheel. What are your goals there and embedding it within this action plan? So we're making sure that we're not doing two different things or seeing it as separate, but we're aligning all of our efforts with our school improvement plan. So that's what we learned with our 12 high schools. We worked with them, like I said, for 6 years. So now we're in what we call iteration number 2. We started this in 2021. We will work with them also for 6 years. So we are now in year 3. We just started year 3. We have 15 high schools that we're working with, again, across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They are also, again, urban, rural, and suburban. They are all public schools. Some of them are charter schools. And then 4 of the 15 are cyber charter schools. So we have a lot more cyber charters in this round than we did the other one. And then again, we're really excited to continue our partnership with HUNE as we're looking again at how do we increase student engagement and family involvement with our sites and our centers. So that's part 1. That's where we've been and where we're going. Let's take a look at part 2 and talk about an early warning system, because this is where it made such a difference, even just analyzing the data and knowing who was off track. Even before we did anything, that made a difference. Just knowing who those students were to intervene early. Then what made the difference if they actually graduated or not was what was the intervention that we provided. So we want to take a look at this process to make sure we're really supporting students. So when we look at this, Build a Grad Nation, they looked at this. The early warning system is a collaborative process. Again, you're getting a team together of colleagues to make sure that we're analyzing the data appropriately, efficiently, and effectively. We want to make sure then we're outreaching to our administrators, our parents, our family members, the students themselves, and our communities of how we're sharing that data and making sure that their students are on the pathway to graduation. So Johns Hopkins University is one of the key places where research has taken place with Dr. Robert Belfons. In his research, he looked at multiple data points to see what makes the difference if a student comes to school or not, stays in school and then graduates. And here's what he found. He found 3 things: attendance, behavior, and course performance. Now, let's think about attendance for a moment. How many days a month can a student miss that it can start impacting their progress and their achievement or just success? How many days a month can a student miss? What do you think? I'm seeing 1, I'm seeing 3. Okay, the correct answer, meet in the middle, is a 2, right? So 2 days a month, that's not a lot, right? So if I'm missing just 2 days a month, it doesn't even have to be back to back, that can start impacting, particularly in high school, where if you miss a day or 2, boy, you can really get behind in your content, your coursework, So that makes a big difference. Behavior, we're looking at 2 categories. School code of conduct, those are your office discipline referrals, and then we're looking at state reportable offenses. What are those major things like weapons, drugs, those types of things? Course performance, we're looking at 2 subject areas, English language arts and mathematics. Now that's not to say if a student isn't passing biology or history or some other subject, they're obviously at risk of not graduating. But if a student's having trouble in either English language arts or mathematics, they're probably going to have trouble in history, in science. So we're really focusing in on those 2 subject areas. So how do we align that? What do we use to say, how do we know if you're off track or not? So we utilized early warning system metrics. Again, this comes from Johns Hopkins University. We started this with our first iteration of schools, and we're continuing utilizing these early warning system metrics. So attendance, we're looking at if I'm in school more than 90% of the time, I'm green. 80 to 90 is yellow. If I'm here less than 80% of the time, I'm red. Behavior, we look again at school code of conduct. Again, what does the school deem as an office discipline referral? So those are the number of incidents. So if I'm green, I have 0 to 3. 4 to 5 incidents is yellow. More than 5, then that would be considered red. State reportable offenses, it's either you have one or you don't, right? You're either green or you're red, all right? There's no warning, right? So again, those are those more serious offenses. Then when we look at mathematics, if you have a score of 70% or higher, you're green. 61 to 70 is yellow. If you're less than 61, then you're red. Now, your school district may have different cutoff points for grades. That was probably one of the most varying topics when we go from school to school. Some consider a 70 failing or 69 is failing. But we wanted to make sure that all of our schools were being calculated the same way. So all of them use this early warning system metrics based on national research, regardless of what their local decision made. But you all can look at what is your local school district utilizing for grades, and you could utilize that here for your early warning system metrics. Another way to kind of look at this is when you're looking at 90% of the time, if I'm here, then I'm on track. I don't have any suspensions or expulsions or mild behavior. I'm passing. You're on track. But if we really want to look at, are you college ready or even ready for the career field where you need to have a high level of success? I'm here more than 95% of the time. Again, I don't have any behavior issues, and I'm also a B or better in my coursework. Anything less than that, then I'm sliding or I'm off track. So this is just a nice, quick, easy way to take a look at, again, what we're looking at with red, yellow, and green, and just kind of categorizing that. So our schools utilize different data systems. Some use PowerSchool, some use OnHand, some use Sapphire. So let me poll all of you, how many of you are utilizing an early warning system? Anyone utilizing an early warning system? Okay. What I want to implore all of you to think about is you may have or recognize some of these systems already. You say, you know what, our school district uses that. Our schools didn't even realize what their systems could do. They didn't even realize that if I contact the company, we can get these reports. It's just a matter of knowing what to get. So if you share those metrics with your data coordinator, with your IT, so if you have a contract with a particular company, say, here's what we want to look for. We want to run this report. And so then they can create those reports. And sometimes it's not a bigger cost, or guess what? You're already paying for it. You didn't even realize that that was embedded within the system you're already using. So it may not be going out and buying any new system. It's just making our system that we currently have work. So that's a big thing that can happen. The other thing is that I mentioned we met on a monthly basis with that core team. So that core team is analyzing early warning system data. And we need to make sure, I love this, where we're looking to see who's on track and who's off track. But part of that meeting is organizing the adults. Who's doing what? What kind of professional development do we need? What kind of supports do we have in place? When we think about resources, a lot of times we think about software, licenses, textbooks, materials. Resources are also people, your personnel. So you want to make sure that who do we have in place, or maybe where do we have gaps, and how are we going to fill some of those gaps there. So we had these team meetings, and then we created this team meeting protocol. Now, I don't know about all of you, but it's like, when do we have time to meet once a month? This protocol is designed to be done in 45 minutes. Most of our schools use 60 minutes. You're thinking, what? Really? You can do this. Now, you have to have your data prepared ahead of time. So if I have my early warning system report of who's red, yellow, and green in attendance, behavior, and course performance, then we can have this data team meeting protocol where, if you just take a look at it, you just put the date, who's collecting the data and going to have those reports available to us. You have a facilitator, a timekeeper, and a recorder, and those roles should change every month. So one person's not always taking the notes, or one person's not always facilitating it, but those roles can rotate. Then the first 5 minutes we spend, let's just look at the data. Let's take a moment to reflect. What are we seeing? And then for about 30 minutes, we have a conversation. What trends are we seeing? Do we notice there are 9th graders are more at risk than our 12th graders? How many are off track in these areas? So you're looking at trends. Then you spend about 5 to 10 minutes with announcements and next steps. What do we need to do from here? Do we need to have smaller group meetings after this to meet with the students who are off track? Or guess what? What's going on in math? We have all these students, they're taking Algebra 1. So we need to talk to the math department about what's happening with algebra. Then you end on a positive note. You always want to leave on a high note. So then you spend the last 5 minutes having people share what's one thing. So again, I'll show you how you can access this data team meeting protocol. It's worked very, very well. The other thing is we have a lot of attrition. So many people are leaving, coming and going, whether it's retirement, whether it's they're going to another place, or they're going to another profession. When you have a data team meeting protocol, no matter who's coming in and out, you have this system in place. So it's really useful to have. Again, beyond that monthly meeting, you may want to meet with individual students. So I want to meet with Jeff and have a conversation with him and tell me what's happening and why you may not be doing well in mathematics or whatever it may be. So we created this individual student data team meeting protocol where you could list who are your students who are off track, in what areas, what's on their IEP, what other data may you be collecting. Having a conversation with the student, with them, and then the family member reaching out and who's going to be responsible for looking at the student who may be off track. So you can also take a look at that. So here's our process. Let's get that early warning system in place. Then let's make sure we're intervening appropriately for our students. And then let's make sure we have the action plan and develop it so we have the personnel as well as the materials and resources and time that they may need to be successful. Okay, so part 1, what was our state systemic improvement plan? Part 2 was the early warning system. Now I want to share with you part 3. Where can you find some of these resources, or what are some things we did to really help our students to be successful? So all of you have this handout. It's called the ABCs for Equity. So one of the things we want to take a look at is what are some ways we can help our students, again, around the areas of attendance, behavior, and course performance. So you can access this publication on the patent website. You can download it or you can order it for free. And again, I will show you where you can access all those materials. And it's available in English and it's also available in Espanol. So you will have both of those available with you. So let's break this down a little bit because I want us to think about some of those qualitative factors as well as quantitative factors. Attendance. Here's the question around attendance. Do you feel welcome? Is this a place that I want to go to? What's the point of me logging on every day if I'm in cyber education? Is this a safe place? Is this a welcoming place? So one of those things we want to think about is what kind of responsibility are we doing to make sure our students feel welcome, they have a voice in school. Hopefully your students, if they're involved in positive behavior interventions and supports, you have a student team That's critical at the high school level. So do they feel welcome? Are they in clubs and organizations? I walked in one school not too long ago, and they had different flags representing the countries of the families that attended that school. And it was so exciting. It was like a little United Nations. And I said, how exciting would this be when you walk into this building, and I'm from another place, and I come and I see the flag that's represented there. So are we making a connection? A few years ago, I went to Haiti. I work with an organization called High Hopes for Haiti, and we're working with a school down there, and so I went to visit. And I remember I was sitting in the airport at Port-au-Prince, and we were at a little cafe, and there was the big, I'm from Pittsburgh, there's a big Steelers sign. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's Steeler fans in Haiti. Like, I just made a connection. So, like I said, are your students, what are they seeing and feeling when they come into your school? Do they feel like they belong? And so one of the things we want to take a look at is absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism isn't just unexcused absences, but it's also excused absences. And this is something we need to work with families on, because they may say, well, they're excused. But you know what? If I'm receiving occupational therapy every Wednesday, 7th and 8th period, I'm still missing 7th and 8th period. So we need to make sure, even if a student is excused, what are they missing and how can they make up that work? So chronic absenteeism is not just unexcused or suspensions, but it also includes if you have students who are missing even if it's excused. So we want to take a look at that. Attendanceworks.org. How many of you are familiar with attendanceworks.org? Anybody? Whoa, you guys are going to be blown away by this website, all right? Check it out, because they provide what are some things we can do as a school, as a community, to encourage our students to be here. So they look at this as a multi-tiered system approach, where tier 1, what are we doing to acknowledge our students who are here and coming to school, right? That can be part of your positive behavior interventions and support system. So what are some things we're doing? How are we acknowledging our students for being here in school? Tier 2 is looking at what are some things we may do with a small group of students or some of our students who may need just a little bit more intensive intervention because we're starting to see them chronic absenteeism. And I have to tell you, this is what we're finding. The students we're starting to see drop out of school, they're the ones that not necessarily have the behavior problems. They're kind of surfacing under the radar. And here's what happens. They start disengaging in school, then they start not coming to school, and then obviously then they eventually drop out. So tier 2 could start seeing, who are those students we're just starting to see, oh, they're missing more than 2 days a month already. And even maybe an excused absence, but what's happening that we're not seeing? Or they're coming in late every day. Are they working late at night? Is that why? So that's tier 2. Tier 3 is looking at what are those intensive supports, more like our students who may be truant, or their families need more support also, and looking at that. So we're looking at this tiered approach. What are we doing to acknowledge students? And also, you don't need to focus always on perfect attendance. I think that's a misnomer. Because what happens if you say, well, if you're here for the month, then you get something. Well, it's November 1st, I'm absent, I'm out, right? So you may want to look at goals for the week around attendance. It doesn't have to necessarily be perfect. And then you build upon that. So attendanceworks.org has a lot of resources. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, a school, and this again I got from this website, said, we're going to do a campaign. It's called Strive for Less Than 5. Strive to be here try not to miss at least 5 days of school a year. They did this campaign. They did billboards around the community, local businesses. They gave out magnets to the parents, to the family, and say, okay, we want to strive for less than 5. On the playground, they had signs up. So this became part of the whole community, not just the school and the families, but local businesses had posters up, strive for less than 5. Think how simple that is, right? Strive to be here as much as you can and try not to miss at least 5 days of school for the year. And that's one of their campaigns. But that's an idea that you can get from that attendanceworks.org. That's just one of the things that they had. Let's take a look at behavior. So behavior, we're looking at what are some of those restorative practices that we may be implementing instead of always going to suspension and expulsion. Can we look at alternatives? Are our policies pushing our students out, right, instead of encouraging them? What happens? Do you ever have students who come back to school? Maybe they dropped out and they're coming back. Do we have anything to welcome them? We're glad you're here, that you came back. So those are some of the things that we want to take a look at. What are our policies and procedures around that? So again, looking at our positive behavior interventions and supports, what are we doing to acknowledge all students? Then looking at maybe some supports at tier 2, some things like check in and check out. And then tier 3, looking at something like check and connect to help our students around that. So I want to share with you again about Check and Connect from the University of Minnesota. They are, like I mentioned, one of the few mentoring programs or even interventions that has research behind it. What I'm excited about when I look at their research is when you look at their sample, many of their students are students with disabilities. They're students who maybe come from high impoverished areas as well as wealthy areas. So they look at a variety of students when you look at their sample, and it's a one-on-one. We have a mentor who's teamed up with one student, and you're meeting with them, on a regular basis. They also try to take a look at a mentor being with the student at least 2 years if possible, so you're creating this long-term relationship. So there's 4 components of Check and Connect. You have the actual mentor who has this long-term commitment. And what I think is really important about the mentor is persistence plus. Because guess what? A student who's maybe not coming to school is really struggling. They may be very skeptical of, why are you trying to help me? Who are you? I had a good friend of mine who was working not with Check and Connect, but a different kind of mentoring program, and he was doing a lot of different things, and the students said to you, why do you care so much? He couldn't believe, he's questioning him. He's like, who are you? You're not my father. You're not, why do you care so much? The student couldn't understand. Here was this compassionate, caring adult. But over time, they came to really have this great bond and relationship, and the student did really well and then graduated from school. But that's that persistence plus. Sometimes our students who are resistant need us the most. If a student has one caring adult, one caring adult, they're more likely to stay in school and graduate. So that's what we're talking about with something like Check and Connect or something else. The checking is we're looking at data, multiple variables, going back to that early warning system data, tardiness, all other types of things, and then we're trying to make a connection with the student. What are you interested in? Let's do some problem solving. Why is it that you're coming late to school? Tell me what's happening. How can I support you? How can we get some supports for you? And then finally, what I love about this is how are we engaging the families? Maybe just doing some check-ins with the families, sending them a text, letting them know how they're doing. So again, the communication I'm having from the school is always negative, it's positive. So there's a big family piece that's involved with Check and Connect mentoring. So some of you may be familiar with this, but PBIS incentives. And this is a great resource to take a look at. Again, how can we incentivize our students in some ways to come to school? And it doesn't always have to be food, right? I know if you feed them, they will come. I get that, but a lot of our funding that we have through IDEA, food's not permissible, so we have to look at other things. So what I love about this resource, it even has a column that says, here are some rewards that's not food, right? So what are some other things you can do? It's also great that sometimes it's not even a tangible item. It could be a social privilege, like you get 10 more minutes to be outside and have a volleyball tournament, or maybe you want to be on your phone a little bit longer. You're allowed to be on your phone for a little bit longer, right? So those are the types of things that I would highly recommend. Also, if you're working in cyber schools or your students are taking courses online, there's some incentives for distance learning. So how do we get them to log on? How do we get them to stay on? How are we going to turn your camera on, right? So think about the Jetsons again. We're thinking about not all of us are sitting in a brick and mortar building anymore receiving our instruction. So how are we going to support that? So take a look at that and get student voice. Again, you may want to survey your students with some of these ideas that are presented in that as well. Okay, then we have course performance. So this is where we're looking at how are we encouraging our students to maybe take some of those more academic courses, right? Just because I have a disability doesn't mean that I can't be in the AP classes or the National Baccalaureate classes. So are we having high expectations for our students to make sure that they have that access? Again, are they seeing themselves reflected in the content? What's interesting is one of our rural sites in our first iteration, it's a really great community. It's a smaller group. Like I said, it's a rural setting. And their students take the Keystone exams typically in 10th grade. And you know, the Keystones, we have Shakespeare and everything else. And I was an English teacher, so I love it. But not everybody loves Shakespeare, right? And you're like, okay, we have the Keystones. So what they did was they created, and they noticed that a lot of their male students were dropping out of school or not finishing, or English and writing wasn't their favorite subject area. So the junior and senior year, they started creating different course options. And one of the course options they did was for English, the content was hunting and fishing. Guess what? They were still using the PA standards aligned system and the standards. They're still analyzing, synthesizing, and comparing and contrasting, but the content they're reading is around hunting and fishing. It made it very exciting for them, but they're still doing the same level high content. They're doing higher order thinking skills. They're writing about it. What's your plan? So when we talk about culturally responsive practices, we're looking at multiple different things. So look at your culture and climate and making sure that are we again engaged, how can we engage our students and make it culturally relevant for them? That's just one example that sometimes isn't obvious. So one of the other things you can think about is what are academics looking like? Again, what are we doing to support all of our students? Do they have access to the general education content? Algebra is a big one. Algebra is a gatekeeper in general, whether you have a disability or not, whether you graduate from high school. So students who fail algebra, that's a key indicator whether you may be successful or not to stay in school. So that's a really key subject area. So again, what are we doing for everybody around algebra? And that's just one example. Tier 2 is, again, what are those supports we may need to put in place for some of our students who aren't doing well? And then Tier 3. One of the things we found in working at the high school level with MTSS academics is sometimes it's hard to get the Tier 1 approach until you start looking at Tier 3. So I was working with one school, and I'm bringing back the algebra example. We had a lot of students failing algebra. When we have that many students failing algebra, that tells us there's a systemic problem. So they needed to change what they were doing for algebra. So we kind of went from looking at Tier 3, then we looked at how we could help improve Tier 1. So we kind of went the backdoor way. So you may find that at the high school level or middle school level as well, is that sometimes you may have to go in a different route. The other thing is credits. Do your students know how many credits they need to graduate? I'm always amazed when I go into schools and I'll say to a student, do you know how many credits you need to graduate? And they're like, I don't know. Like, oh, that worries me. Do the families know how many students need to graduate, credits they need to graduate? So looking at not only the number of credits, but how many credits do I need in particular subject areas? So a few years ago, I was attending a conference and they had where families were given a magnet of these are all the credits you need and in what subject areas, how many you needed. So they gave out magnets to everybody. Whether it was when you came to a basketball game, a football game, a play, not just a parent-teacher conference, some mailed it to them, but they had magnets so everybody knew how many credits you needed and in what subject areas. Is this easily accessible on your website? So if I went to your website, would I know right away, this is if you come here, here's what you need. So whether you do a magnet, whether you do it on social media, whether you have a poster in your building or however you want to promote it, you do a social media blitz. Hey, guess what? They just want you to know. Everybody needs to know how many credits they need and in what subject areas. All right, so I'm going to go back to that alternatives for programming credit recovery. So many of our schools took a look at how we can offer some alternatives. So we had one school where they created a classroom where they could have different areas of students come in, or different periods where students could come in and do their coursework. So maybe instead of taking fourth period, you go to the history class. I'm going to go to this classroom fourth period. I'm going to do credit recovery online during fourth period. Some offered after school programming. Some offered summer school programming. I had one school say to me, you know, this student's just going to fail and then they're going to think, well, then they can just take credit recovery. Like, well, why are we waiting to fail? Why don't we offer them credit recovery now? Like, if they don't want to take that class, let's get them credit recovery. Or maybe they take it at home online. But they found that having a teacher in a place where students could go during certain periods and do that work versus you're just giving the student and putting them on a computer, the teacher helped them look at where are you, what are your goals, here's how you're doing, they're tracking their progress. That made a difference. So thinking about where and how we're offering online programming, credit recovery may be one way to do that. Internship opportunities. Look at what we're doing on site or career and tech education. So students get an opportunity to get some job hands-on experience. So one of our sites, they really took a look at, for the on-site school business, they created a school cafe. And they had their students who, particularly our students who were in life skills programming, ran the cafe. So they changed a corner in their library to a cafe. They have a chalkboard that puts all the specials in. They have a counter, they have a cash register, and they made it, and they have an iPad where you could take, they don't take credit cards, but I mean, they take a look at using it as a cash register. And every Wednesday morning, they run this cafe. They make it part of their curriculum, whether they're doing math, or doing graphics, or doing writing. So it's really a great way to make sure that you're utilizing some of the resources for the online cafe. Check out local businesses too, where can you do a local business? Can we do an internship here? So that can come up great with your secondary transition plans and making sure that students can be successful in other ways, and also your career and tech education. So to find our resources, again, this PowerPoint is available on the app. So this shows you the step-by-step guide of how you can access these materials. So let me show you a little bit of ways you can do that. You can go to the patent.net, and then if you go to graduation and post-secondary outcomes, you click graduation rates, then you can click the publications. So let me share with you some of our publications. You have the ABC for equity. We also have others called the ABC for students. So this was actually our first ABC publication, and we surveyed students in focus groups to see what are some things you could do to do better around attendance, behavior, and course performance. One of the ones they said for course performance was to team up with a friend to study for a test. And I love that. We didn't think of that when we were looking at it. They came up with that. So when we're meeting with students, whether it's during an IEP meeting, maybe a student's been absent, this is in the counselor's office. Some of our sites made this into a poster, or they got these publications and ordered them, and they pass these out to students. Here are things you can do around attendance, behavior, and course performance. This was so successful with our students, we did this with our families. So we have an ABC, what can I do as a family member to help around attendance, behavior, and course performance? Again, we looked at focus groups of family members and different ones who could say, what are some things you recommend that you could do around attendance, behavior, and course performance? So again, we give these out during IEP meetings, other things. One school had these out again during events, so anyone could get this publication. So that's just a way you can think about it. Those data tools and action plan, again, here are the steps and how you can access that, but you can look at our action plan template. If you have a template already, great. Just think about that family engagement and equity. Are you incorporating those two things? The early warning system metrics is located here. Also, the data team meeting protocol for the team and the individual student team is also available here that you can download. And those are all in different areas. You can again download, or you can order these booklets to share. Here's the one-pagers of the 7 coherent improvement strategies to share with each of your sites. We also have a video of students who shared with us their experience of what it was like to graduate. We also have Hune and I teamed up to do a quick video tip. This is particularly helpful for families, again, around the ABCs. It's in English and in Spanish. So you'll see myself in the English one, and you'll see Luz Hernandez in the Spanish one, her voice. And we're these really beautiful avatars. So I have long flowing hair and I'm thin, and so I love it. Yeah, so yeah, you can be as creative as you want to be. We also did some podcasts. So Barb Mozina, who was passing out the content earlier, she's our BSE advisor that works with us on our state systemic improvement plan. She and I were invited by the IDEA Data Center to share what we're doing nationally with our sites around school improvement and increasing graduation rates. So if you enjoy podcasts, and you don't listen before you go to sleep, but you could if you want to. You can take a look at, they're about 20 minutes long each, of what we're doing here in Pennsylvania around what I've talked to you about today. And there's just some more ideas on that. Here are the online resources so that you can access the PD Equity Hub. You also have the PA Career Zone, our Standards Aligned System, Transition, our podcast that I just mentioned. And then the national resources, again, check out that attendanceworks.org. I also have the Learning for Justice, the National Dropout Prevention Center that I told you we collaborated with early on, and also the National Center for Systemic Improvement. And then you can also access that PBIS incentives, that free book I was sharing with you. Also, that Build a Grad Nation. There's just some information there around early warning systems. So lots of great resources right here in Pennsylvania, but also check out some of those national resources to see what's happening in other states. So before we end today, I think we have a few minutes. We have about a few minutes remaining. Does anybody have any questions? Questions you'd like to ask? Yes.
So I was wondering, have you looked at any cohorts with the effects of COVID and how that kind of affected attendance?
Yeah, so that's what we're looking at now. Well, we did a sustainability survey for our first iteration of schools. And one of the things they found is they were so glad they had these things in place, because then when students started to come back, what they've had to work on more is the attendance issue. And how do we get students to come back more? And so that's where our current iteration of sites is, one of the things we're looking at is, again, how do you get students to come back to school and make our schools more welcoming? And one of the schools, like I said, creating the cafe, having a student team and student voice, reaching out to families on positive things versus just always negative, because truancy became such a big issue. So I think the biggest impact we saw was around attendance and getting them to come back. But then it was also things like dress code. We had students who had the hoodie on, and then they're getting, sent home because they had the hoodie. It's like, well, you know what? For the last 2 years, they didn't have their camera on, and maybe they didn't have a hoodie on. So they're trying to look, again, what are some of the policies and things we may need to change that we had before COVID versus now? Is it a big deal if they wear their hoodie, or, in the hallway you can, but during class you take it off? So they're looking at some of those types of things. Yeah, that's a great question though. We're still trying to get the data on that, but we've had to intervene differently, particularly around attendance and even behavior. Any other questions? Well, I just want to acknowledge, again, I want to thank you for today, and this takes a team of people. I want to thank Jeff Matheson, who is here. He works in our Patton, Pittsburgh office. Again, we had Luz Hernandez at Hune, Barb Mozina from BSE, but it's not just me. It takes this committed group of people. So you can see who are the consultants who are working on this in each office. So I encourage you to reach out to them if you have questions. And I will also be glad to stay around and answer any questions you may have. But thank you all so much for your participation today.